In this video, I want to discuss the respiratory system, its structure, and its function. It's a simple system, but very, very important. So your respiratory system, as you probably know, its first function is for gas exchange, to bring gas in from the air and put it into the blood so that it can transport to cells and then come from those cells out into the blood and go back into the air. So gas exchange is the first key function. But it also allows you to produce sound. You're able to hear me speak because I'm using air through my larynx to produce sound. The respiratory system also brings in chemicals to the scent receptors in your nose so that you can smell things, which makes eating a whole lot more interesting. It also has some other jobs that are not as directly related to air movement, such as assisting with the acid-base balance of the blood, primarily by getting carbon dioxide out of the blood, because too much carbon dioxide makes the blood too acidy. And it's also involved in controlling body temperature. But we're going to focus mainly on the gas exchange. So there really are quite a few steps to this whole respiration process. There is ventilation, which is bringing air in, and then you have the gas exchange. The oxygen goes into the blood and the carbon dioxide comes out at the alveoli in the lungs. Then the gas gets transported around the body by the blood, where you have another type of gas exchange happening at the body cell level. And finally, you get to cellular respiration, which of course the whole point of doing this physical respiration is that you can get ATP out of cellular respiration. So that's why we're doing all of these steps. And then you have to reverse the whole process to get those waste products of carbon dioxide that are made in producing ATP back out of the cells into the blood, carried to the alveoli in the lungs, and then sent out back to the environment and the outside air. We can think of the respiratory system as having two main divisions, the upper and lower parts of the respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract then is everything that's above the level of the trachea, which is your windpipe. So everything above that entrance into the lungs is the upper respiratory tract. Probably the most important part of this is your nasal cavity. Your nose is just this first part sticking out, but then there's a whole lot of space behind that nose that comes out from your face. It's known as the nasal cavity. And it is a very important part of the respiratory system. It's not a smooth passageway. We can see here they have these little shaded areas which are indicating portions of bone that actually stick out into the nasal cavity, and it's all covered with a very moist, mucus-covered membrane, a layer of skin inside the nasal cavity, and those are all very important in preparing the air to go onto the lungs. The upper respiratory tract from your nasal cavity then goes down to the pharynx, or to the throat, and the pharynx, which I think I have another picture on this, is also shared, of course, with your digestive system. We use our mouth primarily for eating, but we do have a direct air passage through the mouth. So if you've got a stuffy nose, you know you can breathe through your mouth. And if you've been very embarrassed, sometime maybe that you laughed very, very hard and some food went up and out your nose. I know I did that as a child with tomato soup, and I remember the embarrassment even to today. So this passageway is all connected in the back of your pharynx. But then from the pharynx, from this brief time where things are all together, of course you do have the split, one side going into your trachea and one side going into your esophagus. You see your esophagus runs right down behind the trachea. It actually shares one side. They have a shared wall here. It very tightly fit all together. Things are pretty snug inside your body. Other things that you have as part of the respiratory system, we have sinuses, which are basically holes in your skull. They don't show the connecting passageways, but the sinuses do connect also to the nasal cavity and down, before it gets into the pharynx, because the we're not really sure what sinuses are there for, but they do also help in warming and humidifying air, which I'm going to get to in a minute, which is your key role of your upper respiratory tract. They also can sometimes get clogged and don't drain well, and then bacteria infections can build up, and then you have a sinus infection, which is no fun at all. So the upper respiratory tract, as I just mentioned, its primary job is to condition the incoming air, to make the air warm and humid, so that by the time it gets to the lungs, it is just like all the rest of the body inside, deep inside you. Deep inside you, things are warm, around 98 degrees, and they're very, very humid, especially in the air. This is important because gas to move from the air into your body cells, it has to dissolve into liquid first. So you need the inside of your lungs to be very humid and to be very moist. I already mentioned the protrusions, the bumps inside the nasal cavity that slow down the airflow. So the air is going through like a maze before the way after it gets kind of past where your nose ends, but that part inside your skull, it is slowed down a lot, and that gives time for that air to get warmed up and time for it to get humidified. If you've ever been skiing in a very cold climate, not so much South Carolina, but you might have taken a big breath of cold air and your body has responded by a cough, because that air is just too cold and too dry for your lungs. And as I mentioned before, a cough is your body's reaction of saying, get this out of my lungs. I don't want this whatever thing that's not right in my lungs. And so the coughing, when you breathe in really cold air, is because it has not been properly warmed and humidified, and that's what your body is responding to. Another important role of the upper respiratory tract is to filter out pathogens or irritants, like little bits of smoke particles that may be, we don't want them to get into the lungs either. So you have several mechanisms. There are hairs in your nose, as I'm sure you're aware, which can trap small particles. And then there's a mucus layer that is constantly being produced, not just when you have allergies or a cold, but you're always producing a sticky mucus layer that coats the inside of the respiratory tract. So it can provide like a sticky trap for these small particles. And then that mucus is swept by ciliated cells that have little hairs that actually move. So they row forwards and back. So they're going forwards and back, and they're pushing the mucus towards the pharynx. They're always going towards the opening to the esophagus so that we can swallow and digest whatever it is has been trapped in that mucus, use the chemical defenses of our stomach acid to kill off those pathogens. So as I already mentioned, your pharynx, which is really just a fancy name for your throat, is involved both in respiration and digestion. And we did talk about this already with digestion, the epiglottis, which is this very important up top of the trachea. So here in this picture, the epiglottis is right here. It kind of functions like the lids on the trash cans. If you have a wheeled trash can that you take to the curb, we have a green one here at my house, and the lid will flip up and down. And so that's what the esophagus will do. It'll flip up and down. It'll flip up when it's time to bring in air so that air can come in and go right into your lungs. And it'll flip down when you're swallowing so that the trachea is completely covered and will not have any food go in the wrong place, because the only thing you want in your lungs is air. Of course, you can, by swallowing too quickly, or maybe when you're laughing, the coordination doesn't happen and a tiny bit of food trickles down into your trachea, but usually your body responds with pretty severe coughs when that happens, because we don't want anything but air in your lungs. And then right at the very top of the trachea, just under the epiglottis, is your larynx. And this is your voice box. This is the fancy name for your voice box. It's actually made of cartilage, not bone, even though it feels pretty strong. The cartilage is pretty strong. And it holds the vocal cords. It provides the structure to tie the vocal cords so that they can move. So the vocal cords really are the official name of the voice box. Another name for it is glottis. Epiglottis means on top of the glottis. So these sides of this picture here of your voice box. This is what will move in and out. These are your vocal cords, and so this is pretty wide open. This person is breathing so that there's lots of space for air to move in. But if they were speaking, then, or singing, there's going to be about this much space. They're going to be moved in quite a bit so that there's just a tiny bit of air, maybe even smaller amounts of that. The whole purpose of the vocal cords, remember, sound is produced by vibration, and so the air from the lungs is being forced through a small space so that the air will have to bounce around and work hard to get through that space, and it'll set up the vibration that allows us to speak or to sing or to make what other sounds we want to make with our vocal cords. The larynx is slightly larger in men because they have thicker vocal cords, so they need more cartilage to hold onto that strong tissue and the strong muscles that pull it forward and back. So now we've made it to the trachea and we're headed into the lower respiratory tract. And in this part of the system, it's mostly involved in conducting air down to the very bottom. So air is coming in from the trachea, and then there's a set of divisions. We divide into 2 bronchi and then into smaller bronchioles and down till we finally get to the alveoli, which is the end of each of these branches. The tube coming in the trachea divides about 20 times to get down to the alveoli, and these are very, very small. They're not visible. If we were able to look at lung tissue, it would look like a sponge, and you could not see the individual alveoli or alveoli. Both pronunciations I tend to use, and you'll hear me go back and forth probably. The lung itself, there's slight difference from one side to the other. The right lung, which would be this one here on your left, this is your right lung, is going to have 3 main sections. It has divided up into 3 lobes. The left lung is only divided into 2, and it has sort of a little notch on the one side because the heart sits slightly to the left, and then there's a big blood vessel known as the aorta that comes out, also hanging over to the left, and so the lung is a tiny bit smaller, not particularly significant, but it does have to make room for the heart and the aorta to keep the circulation going. You will see these lines across your trachea. This is representing bands of cartilage. Again, very strong tissue, not as strong as bone, a little more flexible. But this is what keeps your trachea open all the time. Your trachea will not collapse. It's like maybe if you've ever seen the ribbed hoses that people use for irrigation and such, it will not collapse in on itself, which is what you want. You want your air to always be able to get in so that you can stay alive, and so the cartilage is holding it open. So the lower respiratory tract, as I said, its job is to transport air in so that the gas exchange can happen. And this passageway divides and divides and divides until the tubes get down so small that you have the very end of the passage where the alveoli live as look like little sacks of grapes almost, which is where you actually have the gas exchange. So most of the way through your lungs, air is just moving through tubes. It is not Oxygen and carbon dioxide are not trading places with the blood. It's just flowing. It's got to get to the alveoli down at the very end in order for anything functional to happen. Your lower respiratory tract also provides you protection against pathogens because, again, you've got mucus layers pretty much all the way down to the bottom. You've got a good mucus coating. And you have ciliated cells, at least in the trachea and the upper part of the bronchi, which will move the mucus not down to the esophagus and pharynx, but in this case, we're moving it up. Again, to get it over the hump of the top of the trachea and slide it to top of the trachea and slide that stuff down to be swallowed to your stomach for digestion. So above the epiglottis, the ciliated cells move the mucus with all the trapped stuff in it down, and below the mucus is moved up by the cilia. You also have white blood cells, the macrophages. These are the ones that can eat harmful organisms by using endocytosis and engulfing them with parts of their cell membrane. And they are freely moving throughout your lower respiratory system to help provide, again, protection against pathogens. And then your lower respiratory system is where we are able to have the mechanical stuff going on, the mechanism for actually breathing, for ventilation, for bringing air in and moving air out. And that's primarily the work of the diaphragm and the various muscles in the rib cage. They contract, which makes this space around the lungs, which is called the thoracic cavity, get bigger, and that allows air to come in. I'm not quite sure how this picture was made, but it gives you a beautiful illustration of all of the branching of the bronchial tubes down almost to the end. We've lost some of the real tiny branches, and you can see that the right lung does seem to be slightly larger than the left lung. This would be the right side, this is the left side, because again, we had to have room for the heart down over here. But it's still, there's going to be a lot of passageways there. So what we're seeing is just the conducting tubes. We're not seeing where the actual gas exchange is happening here in this X-ray, and I'm not even sure how they were able to make that picture, but it does show you how things branch off and branch off and branch off. It kind of looks like a tree upside down. So now we get down to the alveoli, which is, as I said, the functional structure, the place where everything happens. If the lungs are all about getting the gas into the body, well, this is where it occurs. So the alveoli are really small, very thin, tiny sacs of tissue. They're really only 1 cell thick. So this picture on the right of the screen is showing, this pink line around the outside is the cell that provides like the skin of the sac. Like if this was a balloon, that would be the latex of the balloon. And it's only 1 cell thick. And right on the other side, we can see it right here, right on the other side of that 1 cell, we have a small tiny blood vessel known as a capillary. And so there's just 1 cell from the alveoli side and 1 cell from the wall of the capillaries. That is as far as oxygen or carbon dioxide has to move. And so the passageway is very simple, very quick. It actually happens in milliseconds. And so there's not much space for that is needed for things to get the gas exchange to happen. Also, gases move by diffusion. There's no pump or anything involved. They're moving from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. So the oxygen is always at a higher concentration or should be always at a higher concentration in the air than it is in the body. So oxygen is always going to want to move into the blood, and carbon dioxide is the other way around. It's a higher concentration in the blood than in the body, so it's going to want to move out as soon as it's gotten to this situation where it can slide across the cell membranes. There also are these other types of cells that produce a substance known as surfactant that help keep the alveolar sacs expanded. That's because it's so moist. If you think about, if you have water in a plastic bag, how the 2 sides of that plastic bag like to stick together. Well, we need to have something slippery in between, and so these cells produce a surfactant, which is kind of like a fat that allow the 2 sides not to stick to each other. One of the problems with babies that are born prematurely is that their lungs have not produced the surfactant or enough of the surfactant left yet because they are coming too early. And so that is sometimes one of the really big issues with keeping premature babies alive. So let's talk about how we actually take a breath. So air moves in and out of the lungs because of differences in the air pressure. By making your thoracic cavity bigger, by expanding it, you are actually decreasing, you're reducing the internal pressure, and air moves in because it's then higher pressure outside the body than inside the body, and the air is going to flow for wherever there's a lower pressure. If you think about what happens with just a syringe over here, when you pull down on the syringe, so if we start with this one on the right, so this will be our first one, and if you pull down and you're expanding then the inside, you're making more space, that's going to bring air in through the opening, not because it's really being sucked, but because there is now a lower pressure inside the syringe, and the outside air is pushing its way in. And then with breathing, when your muscles relax after you've taken that breath, they basically spring back like they're elastic to that resting position, and that will push the air out. It's not a huge pressure difference change, but it is just enough. But because it's just a little bit of pressure change, that's why you can't do like you see in cartoons, walk around on the bottom of a pond by using, breathing through a hose, because the pressure under all that water would be so much that you wouldn't be able to make this type of pressure change inside your body to bring air in. That's why people have to dive with compressed air in their scuba tanks in order to be able to take the air into their body, because underwater they're living then in a high pressure system. When you're just sitting and relaxed, you breathe about somewhere between 12 and 20 breaths per minute. Larger animals breathe even more slowly. I remember taking the pulse of my horse, or the breaths on my horse, and I think he breathed 6 times in a minute, and his pulse was like 42. You also don't bring in very much air. You breathe about 500 milliliters in and out, and so that's this kind of small up and down line in the middle of this diagram. This diagram is showing how much air could potentially be in your thoracic cavity, but generally if you're just sitting relaxed, you're needing to make some ATP, but you don't have real high requirements, so you don't need a high amount of air coming in. Breathing is an involuntary reaction. It's done automatically. Your brain makes it happen. You don't have to think about it. But of course, you can override that. So it does have voluntary control. If your doctor says, take a deep breath or cough, you can do that, but you just don't have to think about it all the time. If you stop thinking about breathing, then your brain takes over and you bring the air in and out. Now, of course, you can take a big breath in. So this next peak on this graph is showing taking in a big breath. And so we have different names for these different parts. This sort of relaxed breathing in and out is known as the tidal volume, kind of like a tide at the ocean. And speaking of the respiratory system, we can hear my dog here having problems in the background. But when you take your big breath in, you're inspiring, you're taking in air, and so that's known as your inspiratory reserve volume. That's how much you could take in if you took in the biggest possible breath. And then you typically only breathe out a small amount, but if you breathed out the largest possible amount that you could push out, then you have also an expiratory reserve volume. So if you're taking a really big breath and a really breathing in and breathing out big breaths, you might be moving this much air. So you'd be moving many, many more milliliters, several thousand milliliters, maybe 4,000 milliliters of air instead of just 500. But even if you did that, that's not all the air that is present in your lungs. So there's always a residual volume that's left. There's going to be air in the spaces, air left in the trachea, in the bronchial tubes, that is not going in or out, but it is available to provide some oxygen to the blood vessels and to take off some carbon dioxide. So even if you're in the middle of a breath, gas exchange is still going on. That doesn't stop. And I think you could figure that out because you realize if you hold your breath and stop bringing in new air, you don't fall over, immediately collapse. You can go for a while before you start feeling desperate for another breath. And that would be you're taking some of the oxygen out of this residual volume. There are a few non-respiratory air movements, things that don't involve gas exchange that we do with our respiratory system. And they involve coughing, which I've already told you is a response to the irritation of the pharynx, larynx, or trachea too close to the lungs. Something is happening there. Sneezing, another response to irritation, but in this case it's of the nasal passages. Hiccups are caused by spasms of the diaphragm, along with a little bit of help from the epiglottis, because usually you're putting some sound out with those hiccups. And then yawning, which used to be thought as a reaction to needing a little bit of extra oxygen. That's pretty much been disproved, and basically scientists don't know why we yawn. We don't know why yawning is contagious, why if I yawn, you might feel like you need to yawn, or even if our dog yawns, we may yawn in response, or we may make our dog yawn if we yawn. So that's an unusual one. We're still looking to figure out what's going on with yawning, but these are all things that do not make, they're not part of the oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange. They're just the other things that happen in your respiratory system. So in summary, your respiratory system's main function is to bring oxygen into the body so it can be transported to cells for cellular respiration. And at the same time, it removes waste carbon dioxide because that is made as you're doing cellular respiration. The gas exchange itself only happens at the alveoli. Everything else is just a tube that transports the air to get to that place. And breathing itself is automatic, but we can control it consciously if we want to. So that gives you a summary of the overall structures of the respiratory system. The next part we'll be talking about some of the disorders, things that can go wrong, things like colds or bronchitis or pneumonia, which some of you may be too familiar with.